As of this recording, it has only been a couple days since I finished reading Steel Ball Run, but in that short period of time, it has already cemented itself, not only as my favourite part in JoJo, but without a doubt as one of the best pieces of media I have ever uncovered. Part 7, in a sense, is the perfect amalgamation of everything to come before. I think that most people involved with JoJo have at least heard the praise of Steel Ball Run, and in my opinion it's thoroughly deserved. Many of the shortcomings I felt with Part 6 were non-existent here. Stone Ocean's ending is amazing and always incredibly infamous within my head. The problem is it took so long to get there, and I've forgotten the majority of events in the story. Many of the villains were just simply obstacles to slow Jolene and the group down, and many of the arcs stretch out over dozens of chapters without much being accomplished. The slowest part of Steel Ball Run is the opening chapters, with many characters being introduced. It takes multiple chapters for the race to even begin, never mind the length of time it takes for stands to properly make an appearance. On the topic of stands, they work slightly differently. For starters, they're granted by a person coming in contact with the corpse of Jesus Christ, and tend to be far more situational and less obtrusive. Let me explain. In this part, even though many of the stands have humanoid or creature-like manifestations, none of them are really used in physical combat. A few examples of this would be Tusk's Act 1 through 3, Ballbreaker, Heya, Mandem, 20th Century Boy, etc, etc. Only their abilities are used and therefore can't outshine the user, unlike in other parts where I only remember certain stands rather than the user themselves, but instead almost every villain has a well thought backstory, and sometimes arc in their own right, leading to at least me seeing a real improvement in Araki's writing. But stands aren't the only star of the show. Yet again we have another Zeppeli teaching a Joestar a secret magical technique. The spin is introduced to us alongside Best Joe Bro Gyro. It is in a sense a breath of fresh air, and if I hadn't known that Dio and were in Part 7, I wouldn't have put it past Araki to dump stands completely in favour of a new combat system. Actually, one of my only criticisms with SBR is its underutilization of the steel balls and spin mechanic. Two characters use this ability, Gyro, as previously mentioned, and Wekapipo. My mind was really opened up to the possibilities of the steel balls during the Wrecking Ball arc, and Wekapipo's use of them. It really got me thinking what would be possible if more characters were to show up with their own use and own versions of the balls. Sadly, Gyro and him are the only users outside Johnny's Tusk. It's a shame, but the stands in Part 7 give very little to complain about. In particular, Tattoo You, Catch the Rainbow, Mandem, Tusk, and of course D4C. D4C is probably the coolest stand in JoJo outside Heaven's Door. The ability to travel between dimensions and parallel universes is used so well within the story, it makes it very hard for me to not want to dedicate an entire video to the topic. But I will try to limit myself. Dirty Deeds Done Dirt Cheap is the stand of the main villain, Funny Valentine, and allows him to cross between dimensions by phasing through objects, and allows him to pull people and things along with him. If two of the same thing come in contact with each other, they are torn apart. All but Valentine himself, who can actually fuse together with other versions of himself in order to restore his body to full health. There is only one D4C between all versions of Valentine, and if the one inhabiting D4C dies, it is passed on to an alternate universe counterpart, who will return to the base world. The base world being the universe in which the corpse exists, as there is only one, and it can't be moved between dimensions. Did you get all that? Because that was only a quick summary of the ability. But this is to be expected when working with a stand that can manipulate reality so easily, and is explained pretty well within the story actually. Meaning Araki learned from the absolute headache of King Crimson. But seriously though, even if there are a few confusing instances in which D4C is used, it works really well and fits perfectly for Valentine as a character. His drive and patriotism definitely makes him stand out, and the fact that every version of himself still holds that same undying convictions adds to the believability of his character. Valentine is possibly the best villain in JoJo, and that's saying something. The fact that Kira is held so highly within anime in general as one of the greatest villains, it should really tell how brilliant and fascinating Valentine really is. JoJo villains are a topic for another day, and probably will be, so for now let's try not to get off topic. So yes, stands are slightly different in this part, including the stand of our protagonist, Johnny Joestar's Tusk. Tusk develops and evolves from a strange way of harnessing the spin Johnny was taught by Gyro. into one of the most formidable and unbeatable stands in the entire series. Tusk goes through similar evolutions as Koichi's stand echoes from DIU. All he was really able to do at first is spin his fingernails at crazy speed. He could use them to cut through things like a saw or shoot them like projectiles. Even after Act 2 is introduced, it doesn't really become much more JoJo-like. What I mean is every JoJo outside Joseph has had some really strong stands with huge amounts of strength and pretty broken abilities. Star Platinum, Crazy Diamond, Gold Experience, Stone Free. In a way, I guess they all reflect the users pretty well, with all of them being very capable and strong in their own right. This makes Johnny a very well needed change of pace, as he is pretty much starting from zero, not even being able to walk. The development of Tusk is also a development of Johnny himself, as by the time he's acquired Act 4, he is now able to walk again. He's almost unbeatable by the end of the part, and that really gives him some much deserved development not found in other JoJos in the series. I really like Johnny as a character, as I think by now Araki has really mastered the way of writing a character. I feel I could see a few hints of this within Part 6, but I don't feel it ever reached the heights of SPR. Minor characters such as Ringo and Mountain Tim are made to feel truly like real people. In the short amounts of time they actually show up and are present, making it hard to conclude who the real villains are at times. Who is the real villain? Well, in my opinion, there really isn't one. Almost everyone in the story does terrible things, including Johnny and Gyro. Yet again we return to Valentine, where he stands alone as the most selfless character in the story. His undying love for his country is admirable, and his urge to bring only great things upon it is something many people share in. The lengths he goes to is certainly far and definitely morally questionable, but nevertheless you can't help but respect him. I was right alongside Johnny in the final chapters of the Love Train arc, when he really wants to believe Valentine so badly. It was one of the most emotional scenes in the entire manga, and I loved it. Valentine is great, Johnny is great, and Gyro. Oh, Gyro. Gyro is the third Zeppeli of JoJo, and is more of a main character than Johnny is, especially in the opening chapters. There's hardly a negative thing I can say about Gyro. He's just so lovable and charismatic that I can definitely see the argument for best JoBro. He gets a great introduction to the story, with the first stage of the race being one of my favourite arcs of Part 7, and Gyro had a key role in that. He was very mysterious at first, and his tsundere-like attitude gave nothing away. I really think by this stage Araki couldn't write bad characters. The high intensity of the first stage really let Gyro shine, with his questionable tricks and cunningness giving a fantastic first impression as one of my favourite characters in manga. Now I'm going to move on to the ending, and that's obviously spoiler territory, even though if you have got this far you've probably been spoiled many minor plot points, and if you're watching this video you've probably read SPR yourself, so here we go. I think the ending was pretty good. I think there's a lot to it, so it might be a while. The build-up in the beginning was immense, with the race against time that really began to press itself on Johnny and Gyro from the end of the Civil War arc onwards. The fact that Valentine was only in need of the head really built up that pressure. If we move on to when shit really started to go down, I just really love the effects of D4C and what was possible during Dio and Hot Pants' infiltration of the train. There was nothing I would change about that scene. Just that it was sad that Dio died cheaply. Though I have to say it really set up the final chapter really well, and I loved that. Hot Pants had it rough though in the end, but it was understandable that she dies. Just, I think fate was harsh on both of these characters. I'm not going to talk about them individually because I really don't feel like it. Just let it be known I feel like this was the best version of Dio, and Hot Pants was way more likable than I first thought she was, so there you go. During the Love Train arc, I found it slightly confusing and underwhelming at points. I didn't like Gyro's death. I knew he wasn't going to survive the whole story, but I felt it maybe could have been done better. We only ended up seeing Ballbreaker for a few seconds, which was a shame, but after his death, the arc really started picking up steam. Johnny finally acquired Act 4, and there was nothing I could complain about after that point. He got a stand that was unbelievably powerful, but was so far from a cop-out, like Star Platinum and GER felt. Both of them felt like Araki had written himself into a corner and needed an ability that could defeat the insane stand of the villains he'd created. Though I liked the reveal of Star Platinum's time stop, I wasn't as fond of Gold Experience Requiem's, even though I thought the ability itself was really cool. Fate of Valentine felt fulfilling, and the infinite spin that made his demise was perfect in my opinion. Even at the end, I felt like Johnny was still growing as a character, and I believe Act 4 was supposed to be a manifestation of that. main difference here that for me wasn't really achieved with Pucci was the idea that the conflict was just two opposing sides that had very obvious reasons for feeling they were justified. Pucci just had a very clouded thought process that was really hard to follow, and many of the acts he committed in his past made it very hard not to just see him as a villain. Kira is held in such a high regard because he's the typical idea of a murderous psychopath you can empathize with. How good villains work is based on how much the audience sees themselves in the character, because that's when they start to empathize with them, which scares them, intrigues them, or both to a certain degree. I'm going to try and hold myself from going into a whole rant about this, because it could be saved for a better video than this one. What I'm trying to say here is Johnny's gaining of Act 4 felt like a logical progression of his ability. The fact that Tusk itself had evolved alongside him the entire journey, making it feel reasonable that he could achieve this insane amount of power. And that note on Valentine was really trying to point out that Johnny only won on the fact that he had better utilization of his abilities, rather than it just coming down to his rationale being more morally justifiable with Valentine's. I really enjoy that level of depth in a conflict sometimes more than the fights themselves, especially in manga form, because I can easily get distracted by the beautiful fight scene in an anime and paying little attention to the underlying themes of the conflict themselves, as opposed to manga where I can really appreciate some well drawn panels but can only really enjoy the fights if the story is on a certain level. After that we had alternate Dio with in the high voltage arc, which did feel clever and a good move on Araki's part. Plus this arc had Johnny lose to Dio, which was more interesting thing about it. I think as much as this was for fans to see a proper showdown between Dio and Johnny, it did carry a lot of weight as everything now centered on Johnny, with Gyro completely gone, and also what could have been the outcome if Araki had been lazy enough to just make Dio the main villain again. I'm not going to dwell on this long, but I felt Dio had a perfect place in the narrative and was sort of a minor antagonist, more anti-hero character who was almost having his own story alongside that of Johnny and Gyro's. There really isn't much more for me now to talk about, so I'm just going to leave it there. Please consider subscribing and doing all that other stuff. Actually, there is one more thing I'd like to mention, and that's how it ended quite abruptly, with 1 or 2 pages to tie up all of the loose ends. The fate of Johnny is kind of left unanswered, and what he did after he crossed over to Europe. But maybe that's just all answered in part 8, so I might read and review that when it finally finishes next millennia.